Thanks for downloading this episode of Start the Week. For more details about Start the Week, please go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. I hope you enjoy the programme. Well, I'm not saying this is unique, but it is rare. A fierce political argument that goes to the heart of our sense of identity and the seriousness of our public culture. When the Education Secretary, Michael Gove, promised to rewrite the curriculum, it was the question of how history is taught in our schools that commanded most of the headlines, and rightly. What we know of history defines how we think about who we are. Knowing your history gives you a clearer sense of the ground you're standing on, metaphorically as well as literally, but which history and which ground. Meanwhile, decades of flinching away from the hard grind of names, dates and memorising has produced a very different kind of history in today's schools. And now, as we stand on the edge of the anniversary of the First World War, these matters are particularly sensitive. Is Michael Gove a nationalist tub-thumper or a reformer all sides of the political spectrum ought to be cheering on? I'm joined by the man himself and by three very eminent and successful historians: Simon Schama, most recently known for his History of the Jews, Margaret MacMillan, whose new book looks at the origins of the First World War, and Tom Holland, the classicist and now the translator, no less, of the father of history, Herodotus. Welcome to you all. Michael Gove, there's been a kind of, if I may say so, slightly caricatured vision of what's been going on in history teaching in schools, all Mr. Men and that kind of stuff. If we go away from the caricature, can you give us the kind of sober, uncaricatured case for changing the national curriculum as you found it when you came into office?
In a nutshell, children didn't know enough, and history wasn't giving children a sufficient sense both of the wonder and magic of the past, but also of their identity and how their identity had been shaped over time by different factors. And you are right that at times the imagination of the popular press, and indeed politicians like myself, has been caught by some of the wilder examples of dumbing down. But behind those wilder examples lies a problem that's existed at the heart of history teaching. We have very many very gifted history teachers, but what we did not have was a curriculum or curricular materials that encouraged students to think deeply and to develop an understanding in particular of the sort of narrative arc or the chronology of these islands.
Well, I was going to ask, how much of this is about having all the beads on the piece of string, as it were, and getting over the very familiar complaint that you get from children that they've done the Tudors 8 times and they don't know how they relate to the Stuarts or anybody else, but they know almost too much about one area?
No education secretary can ever construct a perfect national curriculum, but what you can do is address exactly the problem that you've mentioned, which is that you can sometimes have jumping around, and you can certainly have a sense of a disconnected set of topics, so that as children, including my own, can't remember, well, perhaps didn't even know in the first place, whether the Romans, the Egyptians or the Greeks came in which particular order, and whether or not the Vikings were their antagonists, protagonists, sons or daughters. So in that sense, giving people a sense of chronology is, I think, a high order priority. But then it's not enough, and I absolutely agree, simply to try to revive 1066 and all that for the 21st century. You've got to make sure that there is room for people to explore subjects which in the past were neglected because of our approach towards our understanding of our own country, and you've also got to encourage critical thinking skills as well.
So this is you're packing a lot into a relatively short period of time in a classroom, I would imagine, because teachers will say all the time, you have to catch the imagination of the children with
Absolutely.
the stories, as well as giving them the factual grounding. And then you have to teach them the analysis as well. Simon Schama, I know you've been spending a lot of time in classrooms. Is this simply asking too much of teachers?
No, I think one thing I've encountered is, the sort of weekly heroism of teachers who want to be asked all that. They want to provide the story. They want to do so in a framework which allows them to ask questions. They want to have the expansiveness of time where they can actually do storytelling which provokes important questions about who we are, where we came from. How could you not want to do that in the year of the anniversary of Magna Carta? But they all complain that we can't do this. I met a teacher last night, actually, in Bath, Michael, and I said, well, how many hours? And he said 3 hours every 2 weeks, so he gets an hour and a half, state school teacher, and he said, it's just, I want to do, actually, what the curriculum changes, but I can't do it in this time, and he understands that if more time is asked for, then something else has got to go, and that's a kind of, we're back to the political battle of priorities of what our children need to know. Just one other thing that they always tell me, and they told me out of the corner of their mouths as well, and said, we're losing absolutely specialist history teacher training. We're losing our specialists. They all say in academies in particular, the gym master will come in and the headmaster doesn't care enough to insist on people who've got what seems like, we all know, those of us who write history, the narrative side of it is regarded somehow as a doddle, as something usually, and it's of course the most, well, we all round this table know, it's the most challenging thing if you're both telling a story and doing what Herodotus does in the beginning, ask questions, those two senses of what a story is.
I'd be disappointed if any head teacher didn't want to have someone who was a history graduate teaching history at secondary school. And we're fortunate in that there are now more people applying to be history teachers than we have room for. I suspect it's still the case that there are one or two schools, primary schools perhaps, where some of the teachers don't have necessarily the support that they need in order to teach history as well as they'd want to. But the situation is improving.
Time, do you think? And what can you do about that?
Well, time. I sometimes feel that when it comes to the curriculum, I'm like Horatius on the bridge, because everyone wants to put something else into the curriculum, from horticulture to life-saving skills to art. They're all wonderful things. But there's only so much that we can ask of our schools. And one of the things that I've been trying to do is that when the hordes have come over trying to say, add this to the curriculum, I've been trying to defend the poor bloody infantry of the teaching profession by saying they're already pooled in lots of different directions. History is one of the things that schools should be teaching well, and I'll defend the curriculum in order to ensure that there's space for history to be taught.
Well, I'm going to bring in MacMillan and Tom Holland now, because one of the other great debates in this curriculum is simply what's in and what's out. How much is national, how much is international? I'd like your reflections. Margaret, you've been writing about the First World War, clearly a huge international story. You can't give a national perspective.
No, but I think for school children, you have to start with their own surroundings, where they are. And I think almost learning any history in depth and getting a sense of it is better than doing bits and pieces. But I think you start with the national history, but you also remember that national history doesn't stop at the borders. I mean, ideas don't stop at the Channel. Waves of industry don't stop at the Channel. So if you're going to talk, for example, about British history, you've got to put Britain in a wider context, because so much that's happening outside and so much of what is happening in Britain is they're interrelated. So I think the point that there's not enough time is terrifying, because if you don't understand your own past, you don't understand a great deal about your own society and about the world in which you live. And an hour and a half once a week is not enough to get any sense of the past.
Tom Holland, your latest work is a translation of Herodotus, whose great theme, of course, is the war between the Greek Federation and the Persian Empire. Do you think that's the kind of thing that British children need to know about to have a sense of their own culture, their own civilization?
Well, I think it should be a rule that historians are not allowed to propose that their own topic of expertise be on the curriculum. So in that light, I'm going to say no. I agree that the focus of the curriculum should be on British and Scottish, English, Welsh history, wherever you live. I think that one thing that's very important to emphasise is that because we're talking about the way that children will be studying from primary school through to GCSE, we're actually talking about different levels of knowledge. Obviously, at GCSE level, we can expect full-on historical methodology. But at the level of 7 or 8-year-olds, we're talking far more about sort of apocrypha or myth. So I'm delighted to see the proposal that, say, Anglo-Saxon history feature at primary schools. But I hope that the focus will not be on, I don't know, Alfred's boroughs or something like that, but on burning the cakes. And then subsequently you will come on and discover that maybe the story isn't actually true. But it's important that people have this, these stories, because they are part of the building blocks of our common culture.
Well, it strikes me that the difference in academic historians and so-called popular historians is that academic historians' main job is to say it wasn't quite like that. But if you don't know what the that was, you've got nowhere to start, which is where popular historians come in.
Oh, no, I think popular historians are as committed to questioning received nostra as an academic historian. But I think that you can't, in a sense, it's the difference between studying Newtonian physics at GCSE and quantum mechanics at degree level. Of course, what you study in school is going to be of a different level of sophistication to what you study at degree. You
raise a very, very interesting and probably unresolvable contradiction here, which is, Michael, you want to go right from the beginning. You want to start with the Anglo-Saxons or wherever and end up, well, we'll talk about that later on, where history finishes. Yes. But at the same time, it's at different levels in different periods of education. So there's a danger that the early stuff, for instance, you get at a very basic kind of primary school level, and you don't come back to it because of the importance of going carrying on with the story?
I hope that a sufficient number of children will be so enthused by the history that they learn both at primary school and right up to the age of 14, which is the age at which it's still compulsory, to then go on to take it in GCSE, and I hope A-level as well. And at GCSE and A-level, there is precisely, as Tom says, the opportunity to return to some of the themes that may have entranced you when you were younger, and then to challenge some of the stories that you were told, and to research in greater depth some of the subjects that intrigue. I think it's important, exactly as Tom said, to recognise that if you have that broad chronology, then it's easier for people at the age of 14 or 16 to know how they want to specialise. And the other good thing is that there are more people now, after a lull, there are more people now embracing history at GCSE. The numbers wanting to study the subject are increasing, and it's a good thing.
Michael Gove, sorry, are you trying to foster a sense of patriotism through the British curriculum?
No, I'm a patriot. I love reading the story of heroes and heroines in the past. I'm proud of the role that Britain's played on the world stage, and I suspect that sometimes my own personal enthusiasm...
Whiggish in that regard,
I
at
am,
least.
yes, absolutely. I'll come out on this programme as a 100% thoroughgoing, unapologetic Whig. However... there's a difference between my own personal enthusiasms and the responsibility that I have, or any politician would have, and the thing that I want people to have is an understanding of the past and an ability to analyse. And if students at the end of studying history come out as Marxists who hate the oppressive narrative of baronial rule that is the spine of English history, as long as they love history, I'll be delighted.
Well, that's a very liberal thing to hear from you.
Can I just ask Michael, again, a very nuts and bolts question. The number 14 has just been mentioned.
Yes.
Are we really happy about that? Because teachers themselves have often said we'd be much happier if 16 was the age at which they could drop history.
Yes.
And it may presuppose a kind of two-tier level between 14 and 16, but that many of them are still up for it.
Yes, I know. Again, I have enormous sympathy with that view. But ultimately, when you're constructing a national curriculum, it's a compromise between different interests. The historians, the geographers, the scientists, and indeed the head teachers who have to balance all these competing interests. My hope is, and the evidence suggests that this is happening, that history is sufficiently well taught to the age of 14 that people enthusiastically volunteer to go on. We'll be talking about the First World War later, and of course one of the big issues in the First World War was between those liberals who said that we should embrace the volunteer spirit when it came to the war effort, and others who argued for conscription. I'm on the Asquith side of that debate. I think people should volunteer to study history after the age of 14.
You'll be a Liberal Democrat by the end of the programme.
The notion that history is really equivalent to being gassed in the trenches is one of the more pessimistic definitions of the time.
It's different ways of serving your country.
Indeed. Margaret, I'm going to bring you in here because I know one of the other things that we're dancing around here is what is history? I mean, is it the E.P. Thompson history from above, history of the peoples, which has become more and more popular across the spectrum? It starts on the Marxist left, and you now find people like Max Hastings doing history from below with regard to the First World War and the Second World Wars and so forth? Or is it diplomatic history? Is it the history of power structures?
But I think history is everything. I think it's a great, big, messy subject and with a core of chronology and narrative running through it. But I think it is everything. I mean, I think it is terribly important, and I think it gets students interested to let them remind them that these were people living in the past who were not like them, but who did eat, did grow up, did wear clothes, did play games, did go to work. And that's a way of getting students, young people, anyone interested in history, to remind them that in the past there were people who lived, died, had worries and concerns. And so I think history comes both from below and from above. But I really hate that view, which you do get among some social historians, that people who do diplomatic history or political history are sort of cold fish who only care about power and what happens. I don't think that's true. I mean, I think if you do diplomatic history, you're really thinking about the relations between peoples as much as between governments.
Power has squishy consequences, by and large.
Exactly. Yeah. And what decisions diplomats make or statesmen make is often affected by what people in their own countries think, believe, feel, worry about. And so I think history should be all. But I do agree that you have to peg it on a chronology. And if people don't understand the order in which things happen, they're missing a very important part of history. And if they don't have that sense, and however they get that sense, I mean, when I grew up in Canada, we read something called Our Island Story, which wasn't a Canadian book.
We discussed it on this programme.
Well, I think we did. And it's most politically incorrect book you can possibly imagine. But it gave us the stories. It gave us King Alfred and the Cakes, and it gave us, which we then called her Boadicea, and of course we would now say Boudica.
Was that Arthur Bryant? Or...
No,
H.E.
it was
Marshall.
Oh,
H.E. Marshall.
A woman
Actually,
historian.
it's got quite a radical subtext
Yeah.
because, of course, one of the fascinating things about the idea of an island story is that I don't think it is just exclusive to the right. I don't think it is just sort of tub-thumping patriotism. There is also one that would appeal to the left. Last week, for Making History, I went to a neo-diggers camp above Runnymede and spoke to some of the squatters there who said they were there because they were drawing on the spirit of Gerard Winstanley and of the people who drew up the Magna Carta. I mean, it's a mythic take. It's a mythic take. Something sort of Blakean about it. But it's also, it is as potent as the most sort of aristocratic take on the British
exactly.
story.
I mean, English history is the history of an executive, kings or whoever, jealously guarding power, and then the people taking it from them at different times. That's what happened in the Reformation. That's what's happened in the English Revolution. And if you think of some of the heroes of English history, they are people like John Ball, who said, when Adam delved and Eve span, who then was the gentleman? And of course, there are some people who are conflicted between recognising that there's a very powerful strain of English and British radicalism, which was simultaneously patriotic and proud of our traditions and at the same time deeply opposed to power being concentrated. And some people are conflicted because they think that pride in our past is somehow the possession of the right, and it shouldn't be. And as a conservative, I don't think it is.
But it's also fascinating that radicalism in Britain traditionally has always been retrospective. So right the way you're complaining about the Norman yoke or misinterpreting Magna Carta in the Civil War, right up to the present. Tony Benn is a classic example, a radical but deeply, deeply interested in the past.
What about the question of whose history, Michael Gove? Because we clearly live in a very multiracial society, partly formed by immigration. Ought there to be a bit of Polish history? Ought there to be a bit of the history of the Indus Valley and what became Pakistan in our history, as alongside the Normans and the Tudors and the Stuarts and the rest of them?
I think it's a big challenge. I think one of the criticisms rightly made of history curricula in the past is that they tended to neglect Britain, not just Britain's impact on the world, but the world's impact on Britain. But I think that you can go too far. I think that if you are a young Scot growing up in Aberdeen or a young lad in Leicester who's come from an Asian background, you're still a citizen of the United Kingdom. And so I think you need to understand how the institutions around you were shaped. But I do think we need to be imaginative about the ways in which we enable students to know a little bit more about the world. That doesn't necessarily mean identikit multicultural history. You happen to come from South Asia, so we'll tell you all about the Indus Valley.
But I think actually to engage children from an Asian background with the kind of possibly bewildering question, the first question, well, what am I doing here in Bradford or Sheffield or whatever? Not as a kind of gesture of political correctness. Well, I must start with the Indus Valley or the beginnings. That is to really lose the war against time hopelessly. But if you say, well, here's something really odd that happened in the 18th century, a business organisation, a company, the East India Company, within 2 generations was actually governing most of the subcontinent. That's a story of answering their kind of sense of improbability. What am I doing here? And the relationship actually between making money and making power. And that's something, you could tell stories around and make work actually in the classrooms. I wish that whole issue of Britain's relationship, because we're an island story, with Hong Kong, wherever we are, was sort of taken out of the relentless rhetoric of imperial apologetics or multicultural correctness.
Yes, I absolutely agree. I think one of the big debates over the last 30 or 40 years is how the history of Britain and its empire has been taught. And I don't think we've found an exactly perfect resting place, either in our schools or more broadly. And I do agree with Simon that I think that somewhere between patriotic narrative of the white man's burden that we had 100 years ago and an agonised, self-lacerating attempt to say that we were guilty for, raping Africa, somewhere between the two, there is a story that can be told. And exactly as Simon said with reference to the East India Company, it also helps us understand some of the challenges of globalisation as well. Right.
A clammy sweat of cold panic is spreading across the Mar Pate at this point because everyone's agreeing, and you're not supposed to agree. You said, Michael Gove, that nothing was going to be a bigger battlefield of ideological wars and history curriculum, surely what goes in and what comes out is, in the end, political and ideological.
Well, there are certainly ideological interests. I mean, one of the things that I said is that there may well be a Marxist school of chemistry that argues that the protons are oppressing the neutrons, but I haven't come across it yet. And it may well be that there's a Whig theory of mathematics that means that the further you go up the Fibonacci series, the more advanced...
Prime numbers become ever more beautiful.
But basically, the root of it is that for all sorts of reasons, as we've just been discovering, history is about who we are and what we think of our country. And so it touches on very, very deep emotional roots. And that means that any attempt, however well-intentioned, to try to refashion the history curriculum will inevitably provoke some who feel that they have an interest in this fight or their emotions are engaged, who they are is being questioned. And that's what makes it difficult. And therefore all politicians, myself included, have to tread carefully and occasionally, of course, make mistakes.
The first draft of the curriculum was widely criticised for being too national-centred, and you've brought in a lot more international history, but not much European history. And again, there's a suspicion, all these Europhobes are keeping Europe out of the curriculum.
No, I mean, I was going to say, Tim, that attributes to me a degree of cunning and guile that I don't have. The first draft of the curriculum, most people, not everyone, but most people thought simply had too much in it. But I suspected that was always going to be the case, and I felt that we talked about the curriculum being a compromise earlier. This was my opening offer in the negotiating bazaar of the curriculum. And I said, Effendi, I would like much content. And then various other people said, absolutely not, you're asking too much. And what we, I think, arrived at in the end was a compromise that had more of a sense of the narrative arc and the chronology that we've all so far agreed is a worthwhile thing, and also a wider sense of the impact of Britain on the world and the world on Britain.
Tom Holland, we're talking about some of the ideas around history, but many of us started by learning long, long lists of dates, kings and queens and all of that. Did you do that? Was that your first experience of history?
Yes, it was. And what I
too.
particularly remember is learning all the kings and queens of England, which I still recite when I have to go to the dentist. So it has been incredibly useful. Yeah, so I would urge anyone resentful of that discipline to. It does come in useful.
Because there has been a suspicion that simply that pedagogic tradition is too hard work in classrooms. I mean, Simon, you've been in classrooms, that actually the old days of you must learn all these facts before we can have the discussion is something that teachers flinch from.
Well, I would say embarrassingly, even the dentists get stuck around the Ethelberts, actually. So, unlike Tom. So, no, I think actually all history, when we do it and when we research it and when we gather material poised to write a chapter or a whole book, is a matter of a hierarchy of significance. And sometimes things which will turn out to be significant seem to be the most incidental. The story of women footballers in the First World War is absolutely wonderful. Not playing in the First World War, but playing at home, for example, something I yearn to tell myself. But so I think actually I'm absolutely in favour. It's quite clear that because actually the bias of disconnected modules in the old curriculum, that there was a great deal of really indispensable knowledge. We all have these. Some of the stories about children had no idea, about the Civil War, for example.
It's all true, I have to say.
Yeah, it is.
True.
Alas. So there is no question that we have a job of work to do. So, there is some point recovering indispensable knowledge. How did the Industrial Revolution start, for example, and knowing, as Tom does, every single king and their dates.
But I think it's also important to build into the curriculum a degree of flexibility so that you can cope with, for instance, significant anniversaries like the outbreak of the First World War, or particularly Magna Carta, which seems to me an absolutely perfect focus for all kinds of themes.
I'm just
and
interested
arguments.
in people's own personal experience. Margaret, you were taught history in Canada. I'm wondering how different Canadian history was in your day from the British narrative, or was it just part of the imperials?
We were still very much part of the empire, and so we did learn a lot of British history, but we did probably more in the explorers and the early wars between the British and French. I mean, people in Britain wouldn't have worried about that at all. But I think it's right to worry about the schools, because that's where people will get the taste or not for history. But surely what you want to do is give them that taste, give them the tools with which to do it. Let them understand that to understand the past, you're going to have to ask questions. It may not be easy. You need some facts. But remember that history is something, if you get the passion for it, goes on through life. And so people don't stop learning about history when they leave school. But what I think is so important is at school to give them that taste. And of course we'll always argue about history. I mean, it's about who we are, and it's about what we think. And I think Britain at the moment is very concerned about its relationship with Europe. It's very concerned about immigrants. And so these are the sorts of things that come into history. But I do think it's important to let people know that it's all right to question the past, that there's not one version of the past. I mean, I think that's important as well. We shouldn't expect that there should be only one version.
And we're going to see a lot of this in the coming year, Michael Gove, because you're talking about being brought up in Aberdeen and so on. And there's a lot of medieval history here. There cannot be an agreed English version of the Wars of Edward II and a Scottish version, or an English version of William Wallace and a Scottish version, and so on and so on. So we're actually going to see in these islands, I suggest very radically different versions of history being taught with political significance.
I mean, Alex Salmond and indeed the Scottish Government are very interested in history. One of the reasons they've chosen, so they say, to have a referendum on Scottish independence in this year is they hope that the anniversary of Bannockburn will arouse patriotic fervour. There might be some people...
As well it ought.
There might be some people, myself included, who will think, well, if we're going to think of Scottish heroes and an anniversary, then we'll think of Shimmy Lovett leading the troops ashore on D-Day in 1944 to liberate Europe from Nazism. So there are Scottish Unionist and Scottish independence heroes that can both be celebrated in this year. And I think that that Margaret's point is right, that different views of history will be contested. I think it's a good thing that people are thinking historically about this question, because it emphasises how big it is. And when people sometimes say, these political questions are haunted by historical ghosts, well, I think it's a good thing if the ghosts of the past are there to remind us, for example, of the folly of embarking on this course, or the danger of inaction in another. You know, when it comes to the big foreign policy questions, politicians often go awry because they don't know their history.
So let's turn to the big one, which is the First World War. We're on the edge of the anniversary of that, of course. Is it possible, actually, that we can learn anything useful from studying the First World War, Margaret MacMillan? Because I tend to think the answer is no. It's very, very interesting and rich, but it's not going to give today's politicians anything useful to think about.
It might give them the warnings that Michael Gove mentioned, that you should be careful what you decide because it will have unintended consequences. Not a very original lesson. And also be careful of getting yourselves into positions where the rhetoric gets out of control and where you are worried about your prestige or honour. I mean, I'm very concerned today about what's happening in the South China Seas with China and Japan.
So that's a good parallel.
And they're posturing, and they may go over the edge without meaning to. So I do think the First World War gives us a salutary lesson. But I think the reason we learn about it is because it had such a huge impact on our own world. It had such a catastrophic impact.
I don't know any historian who really thinks, actually, that history gives you an exact template, so that some sort of neon light goes on and say, whoa, Sarajevo just around the corner in Kemoe Matsu or something like that. But in a more general sense of history being an education in the human condition, there are, along with the issue that people can stumble into something of an inconceivably uncontrollable and terrible, but also that even under those extreme conditions of catastrophe, human beings kind of muddle through, sort of get through it, and the adjustment to horror that were completely impossible to imagine before is itself. But these are sort of poetic and philosophical illuminations, really. It doesn't give you a primer, actually, against which to grid the possibility of avoiding further trouble.
A light, not a primer. Yeah. Michael Gove, what do you want to come out of this sort of celebratory or memorial looking back in the First World War? Are we going to go back to the patriotic view of the First World War that pertained during the 1920s, when people celebrated unashamedly the victory before the disillusion of the 1930s, which still seems to be with us in many ways? Is it just going to be a grimy catastrophe, or an important war fought against a dangerous enemy which changed the course of European history?
Well, I think what I hope is that there's a deeper understanding, exactly as Margaret said, of how decisions taken by politicians, sometimes in the heat of the moment, can have unintended consequences. A deeper understanding, as Margaret's book and Christopher Clark's book, The Sleepwalkers, point out, about the way in which politicians often take decisions amidst a sea of competing interests and can't always be clear about what follows, and therefore that there should be a greater sense of humility about the capacity of any of us to change the world immeasurably for the better. But more broadly than that, I wouldn't want a single version of the First World War to be passed on to our children, because I think that would be wrong and inappropriate for politicians. I do think that one role that politicians can play is that they can remind people of the steadfastness and the heroism and the endurance of those who fought and lived through those days. And I think that there are lots of individual stories of courage which are worth celebrating.
Absolutely. And at the same time, it's going to knock the reputation of other people who have been national heroes. I mean, if we look at the First World War seriously, Churchill cannot come out of this year ahead with anything other than a highly tarnished reputation.
But since you raise him, actually, if, again, whether in school or whether in our reading, something sort of not exactly redeeming comes out. If you actually, when Churchill then went off to be a soldier, with his reputation shattered by Gallipoli, out of the government, and actually experiences in his Churchillian way, with his sort of silk underwear and all the rest of it, admittedly, I know, but there he is actually at the face of battle itself. That's rather wonderful again. So he goes from being kind of the master of the fleet and
delighted
the biggest
by the outbreak of war. Absolutely. Yeah,
but he goes then to sort of seeing what it's like right there, and that's rather wonderful to read.
I'm sure, looking at Gallipoli, people, his reputation would take a knock. But Churchill defines success in politics as going from failure to failure with undiminished enthusiasm, and that is a useful lesson for all politicians to learn.
But if we think about the reputation of someone like Haig, I mean, that is a topic of massive debate. The issue of whether the British fought a good war, whether they won the war, is a very live and fascinating issue. And I hope that one of the things that will come out of this is absolutely that there is no definitive answer, and that people who study history have to accept that there are some things that we will never know, and there will never be a total consensus.
But I think one of the things I hope will come out is that we don't do this terribly condescending thing from the president and say all those poor idiots back then didn't know what they were fighting for. They were all exploited. I think what I hope we'll gain from looking at the First World War is more of a sense of respect for those who fought. And even Haig, I mean, he has been caricatured as this heartless man sitting in his chateau drinking champagne while sending men into the mud to die. And he was trying to deal with a new kind of industrial war, for better or worse. They all were.
History should, in the broader sense of the word, generate empathy. That doesn't mean agreement with how people operated in the past, but it means understanding of the constraints under which they operated. I do think that the influence of Alan Clark's The Donkeys, Oh, What a Lovely War, even Blackadder, have meant that we see the First World War through a particular prism. And if there's a correction, I think that would be helpful. One other thing is that in the Second World War, we understand very clearly, Richard Overy's done brilliant work on this, that democracies have an inherent, though underappreciated, set of advantages in conflict, that actually we're more resilient and creative societies for being open societies. It's more nuanced in the First World War, but I do think that it is possible to conclude that because Britain and France and the United States and the Dominions, democracies were all on one side, against a militarist and imperial foe, that there are some lessons that can be learned. I wouldn't want to paint it in black and white colours, because no conflict is ever so simple. But I will wonder if there are some lessons to be drawn from that.
I mean, no war is morally straightforward, but I think we have to be careful about glorifying the Second World War. I mean, we weren't fighting entirely with good guys, were we? We had Russia on our side, Soviet Russia, which was one of the most hideous dictatorships, and we did some things which were dreadful. I mean, I think the mass bombing of civilians, the more you look at it, was probably not necessary. But just to go back to my earlier point, I mean, I think there's a danger of thinking that people in the past are poor idiots who don't know what they're doing. And I think so much of the stress in the First World War has been on the people in the trenches. And did they have any sense of what they were doing? Well, yes, they did.
And hearing their voices, which can be found in regimental histories and so on, very close to where we're sitting. I mean, Tom Holland, and go back to Herodotus. And I think of him just going out and collecting stories. He said his job wasn't to sort out what was true and what was not true. His job was to pick up the stories that people were telling in the marketplace.
Yeah. And that is the birth of historical method.
Yes.
And he categorises the different kinds of evidence that he's looking for. So oral testimony, direct oral testimony, hearsay, and then tradition. So, and he chucks it all in. And
he's still stuck with Plutarch's father of lies. Libel, I suppose, in a sense.
Yes, well, Plutarch labelled him Philobarbaros, which is sort of barbarian lover or bleeding heart liberal, might be the sort of the best translation. And it reflects the fact that Plutarch, as a sort of proud Boeotian, felt that that Thebes and the Boeotians had been slandered by Herodotus. But it was also an expression of his unease that Herodotus, although of course he praises the heroic achievements of the Greeks in the Great War, is also fascinated by the Persians and pays them a great deal of respect.
Very interesting.
And more than that, is compulsively interested in almost everything that he comes across. So not just human cultures, but animals, rivers,
the worst
everything.
dissing of Herodotus, most unfair, is from Macaulay, who should have known better, who calls Herodotus a delightful child, precisely because everything sort of glitters for him, which is exactly what Macaulay did
But
himself.
then there's Gibbon, who wonderfully says that he writes both for the philosopher and the child, which I think is probably more accurate, because he does write for the child. There are wonderful stuff there that you can, when I read it when I was 12, I was
very
also
important useful lessons.
themes.
Very important useful lessons from Herodotus. The Persians, before they take any important decision, take it twice.
Yes.
First time sober, the second time drunk. And I think everyone at Westminster could learn from that.
That's the approach the coalition cabinet takes.
Herodotus's war was the great war of civilizations. In terms of the good war, there's never been anything apart from the Second World War which had a better press.
Yes, I think
thanks to
Herodotus is writing
than
about the equivalent of the Second World War, and then Thucydides, of course, who's writing about a rising power and a declining power, is much more our sort of First World War comparison, if you think of Sparta and Athens, Britain and Germany, and then moving on to the comparison, perhaps now America and China.
Are you, as a cabinet minister, aware of kind of unease across the continent about how to celebrate or commemorate the First World War? I keep using the word celebrate, and I shouldn't. But
funnily enough, I think there's almost less ambiguity in some other nations about how to celebrate it. So in France and indeed in Belgium, there is significant political consensus and national solidarity behind commemoration. One of the areas I do find most interesting, funnily enough, is Ireland. In the past, of course, the role of the Irish people between 1914 and 1918 was a very difficult one to commemorate, because you had the Easter Rising and Irish independence, and yet at the same time you had a huge volunteer effort on the Somme, not just from Ulster, but from what was to become the Free State. And I think it's very interesting that our Prime Minister and the Irish Taoiseach want to celebrate together the sacrifice of those volunteers. And I think it says a lot about...
That is going to be politically controversial in the
South.
It will
be controversial. But I think it says...
Canada, Margaret. Can I
well,
sorry.
No, quite right.
No, Canada, we're having a big argument about it, because I think the present government in Ottawa wants to do a sort of rather patriotic thing around Vimy Ridge, which was for us a great moment in 1917, and it's also the, I think it's the 100th anniversary of Confederation. It'll be the 150th anniversary of Confederation. This is why I'm an historian, because I can't do math. So I'm not sure. I think it's being... But this is, again, I think these debates are good, actually. I mean, I think we should commemorate. What I really hope with the First World War is we can begin to look at it as something international and not just look at it within national boundaries, because everybody suffered from it.
And one other... I don't know if it's a lesson, but one other debate that will be illuminated by the First World War is, of course, the Middle East. Because the whole drawing of lines on the map by Mark Sykes and Pico, haunt us to this day.
Absolutely.
And of course, come 1917, while Stephen Harper will want to remember Vimy Ridge, then the Balfour Declaration will be at the heart of the debate. I personally think that it's a great thing that Britain provided a national home for the Jewish people, but that's certainly not an uncontroversial opinion.
And again, look back at some of our traditional heroes, T.E. Lawrence, and then the rise of Wahhabi fundamentalist Islam. Part of the Lawrence of Arabia story, which we don't get much of.
But this is the great lesson that Herodotus teaches, that everything leads on to something else fascinating. Everything is interwoven and interlinked. Yeah. And that's the joy of history, is that you tug on one thread and before you know it, you're off on all kinds of detours down the labyrinth.
And your mission, Michael Gove, is to give young people more threads to tug on.
Absolutely. It's to stimulate curiosity. I mean, we talked very briefly earlier about kings and queens. Kings and queens are chapter headings. They're ways of dividing up the past, and they're also intriguing personalities. If you talk about dividing history into kings and queens, that doesn't mean that you're a monarchist. It just means that you understand that one damn thing follows another. In France, they have kings and queens and then presidents. In America, they break up their history by the personalities of presidents and what happened during that period. In the same way, if we look back at the First World War, that doesn't mean celebrating conflict or making heroes out of generals. It does mean that for 4 years, the world was engaged in a way which is endlessly fascinating, which generates both horror at the waste of human life, but admiration at the courage of individuals.
Historians often say that the 17th century is the hardest century to get kids interested in. I wonder, we're entering a phase where the 17th century is going to be all too relevant in terms of religious conflict and conflict between the different parts of the United Kingdom?
Well, when I was growing up, my history teacher said, and this is the 1950s, said, well, boys, we're not sure what the rest of the 20th century has to offer, but something we know for sure, organised religion is not going to be important so much for history teachers. Yeah. And who would have thought it? And certainly when I was doing History of Britain, the greatest challenge was to dive into these kind of scream-filled caves of sectarian madness. But it had to be done. And it's unbelievably relevant to now. You know, absolutely. Yeah. There was always the sense in which, because we read our great social historians of the 17th century, Christopher Hill and so on, that religion was kind of something that was instrumentally glued on to what was really class interest. Well, you know, to live now actually is to understand that it actually shapes allegiance. It's not just simply a reflection of it.
And I think children can be absorbed by it. My own children are still at primary school, but I remember, eccentric dad that I am, taking them once to watch a sealed knot battle. They were gripped. I also know that from their own watching of horrible histories, Oliver Cromwell and Charles II are two of the most intriguing characters, hilarious as far as they're concerned, and horrific in other ways as well. So I think you're right, the 17th century has been neglected in the past, but has the capacity to interest children like no other period.
And I think that there's an almost science fiction quality to the notion that across the British Isles, people were slaughtering each other.
So there's always a way into history,
Game
isn't
of Thrones.
there? But I mean, there's always a way in. I mean, there's always a way of making it interesting to people. There's always a way of finding a way. And I think part of what we're doing is trying to find that way and trying to get them to experience what Tom talked about, the joy of history, that it is fun. And you never get bored with it because
so
there's
Michael,
always something
give us
else.
A school each in the next year. Tom school, Margaret school, Simon school.
Can I have a school?
An Andrew school.
Yes, I will.
That's very kind of you. And a very fascinating conversation, in the course of which Secretary of State for Education more or less comes out as a Liberal Democrat. He's on the way. He's on the march. Thank you to you all. Simon Schama, who's presently working on Volume 2 of The Story of the Jews, Margaret MacMillan's The War That Ended Peace, and Tom Holland's translation of Herodotus are both out now. There'll be no Start the Week next Monday as Radio 4 begins the year with a look at the next economic giants. Forget the BRIC countries, this is Mint. Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria and Turkey. Start the Week is back on the 13th of January, but for now, thank you and have a very good new year.
There's more information about Start the Week on the programme's website. Go to bbc.co.uk, where you'll also find many more Radio 4 programmes you can download for free.
Problem that's existed at the heart of history teaching. We have very many very gifted history teachers, but what we did not have was a curriculum or curricular materials that encouraged students to think deeply and to develop an understanding in particular of the sort of narrative arc or the chronology of these islands.
Well, I was going to ask, how much of this is about having all the beads on the piece of string, as it were, and getting over the very familiar complaint that you get from children that they've done the Tudors 8 times and they don't know how they relate to the Stuarts or anybody else, but they know almost too much about one area?
No education secretary can ever construct a perfect national curriculum, but what you can do is address exactly the problem that you've mentioned, which is that you can sometimes have jumping around, and you can certainly have a sense of a disconnected set of topics, so that as children, including my own, can't remember, well, perhaps didn't even know in the first place, whether the Romans, the Egyptians or the Greeks came in which particular order, and whether or not the Vikings were their antagonists, protagonists, sons or daughters. So in that sense, giving people a sense of chronology is, I think, a high order priority.
I'm joined by the man himself and by 3 very eminent and successful historians: Simon Schama, most recently known for his History of the Jews; Margaret MacMillan, whose new book looks at the origins of the First World War; and Tom Holland, the classicist and now the translator, no less, of the father of history, Herodotus. Welcome to you all. Michael Gove, there's been a kind of, if I may say so, slightly caricatured vision of what's been going on in history teaching in schools, all Mr. Men and that kind of stuff. If we go away from the caricature, can you give us the kind of sober, uncaricatured case for changing the national curriculum as you found it when you came into office?
In a nutshell, children didn't know enough, and history wasn't giving children a sufficient sense both of the wonder and magic of the past, but also of their identity and how their identity had been shaped over time by different factors. And you are right that at times the imagination of the popular press, and indeed politicians like myself, has been caught by some of the wilder examples of dumbing down. But behind those wilder examples lies but then it's not enough. I absolutely agree. Simply to try to revive 1066 and all that for the 21st century, you've got to make sure that there is room for people to explore subjects which in the past were neglected because of our approach towards our understanding of our own country. And you've also got to encourage critical thinking skills as well.
So this is you're packing a lot into a relatively short period of time in a classroom, I would imagine, because teachers will say all the time, you have to catch the imagination of the children with
Absolutely.
the stories, as well as giving them the factual grounding. And then you have to teach them the analysis as well. Simon Schama, I know you've been spending a lot of time in classrooms. Is this simply asking too much of teachers?
No, I think one thing I've encountered is, the sort of weekly heroism of teachers who want to be asked all that. They want to provide the story. They want to do so in a framework which allows them to ask questions. They want to have the expansiveness of time where they can actually do storytelling which provokes important questions about who we are, where we came from. How could you not want to do that in the year of the anniversary of Magna Carta? But they all complain that we can't do this. I met a teacher last night, actually, in Bath, Michael, and I said, well, how many hours? And he said 3 hours every 2 weeks. So he gets an hour and a half, state school teacher. And he said, it's just, I want to do actually what the curriculum changes, but I can't do it in this time. And he understands that if more time is asked for, then something else has got to go. And that's a kind of, we're back to the political battle of priorities of what our children need to know. Just one other thing that they always tell me, and they tell me out of the corner of their mouths as well, and said, we're losing absolutely specialist history teacher training. We're losing our specialists. They all say in academies in particular, the gym master will come in and the headmaster doesn't care enough to insist on people who've got what seems like, we all know, those of us who write history, the narrative side of it is regarded somehow as a doddle or something usually, and it's of course the most, we all round this table know it's the...
Thanks for downloading this episode of Start the Week. For more details about Start the Week, please go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. I hope you enjoy the programme. Well, I'm not saying this is unique, but it is rare. A fierce political argument that goes to the heart of our sense of identity and the seriousness of our public culture. When the Education Secretary, Michael Gove, promised to rewrite the curriculum, it was the question of how history is taught in our schools that commanded most of the headlines, and rightly. What we know of history defines how we think about who we are. Knowing your history gives you a clearer sense of the ground you're standing on, metaphorically as well as literally, but which history and which ground. Meanwhile, decades of flinching away from the hard grind of names, dates and memorising has produced a very different kind of history in today's schools. And now, as we stand on the edge of the anniversary of the First World War, these matters are particularly sensitive. Is Michael Gove a nationalist tub thumper or a reformer all sides of the political spectrum ought to be cheering?